The gentle, rhythmic clatter of the train wheels on the tracks seemed to echo the nervous beating of Elara's own heart, a steady, monotonous sound that had been her constant companion for what felt like an eternity, carrying her further and further from the faint, fading memories of her old life, a life that had been defined by the cold, judgmental glances of strangers and the whispered criticisms that seemed to follow her like a shadow whenever she ventured into the town square, a place that should have been a center of community, but for her had become a stage for her perceived inadequacies. She sat perfectly still, her hands, which were capable and strong from years of labor, folded neatly in her lap atop the worn fabric of her best dress, her gaze fixed unseeingly on the landscape that rushed past the smudged window, a blur of green fields and distant, rolling hills that were so different from the cramped, soot-stained brick walls of the city she had left behind, a city that had always felt too small to contain her spirit, yet too large to offer her any real comfort or sense of belonging. The letter, carefully folded and tucked into the small leather purse beside her, felt as though it were emitting a faint warmth, a palpable promise that had compelled her to embark on this daunting, incredible journey, a journey toward the unknown, toward a man whose words on the page had been her only solace during the long, lonely nights spent in her small rented room, where the silence was broken only by the sounds of other tenants living their lives around her. This man, Thomas, a farmer from the wide-open countryside, had written to her with a directness and an honesty that she had found refreshing, his letters devoid of the flowery, empty compliments she distrusted, instead filled with practical descriptions of his life, his land, and his needs. He had written that he sought a woman of substance, not of frivolous fashion, a partner who was not afraid of hard work, who valued the quiet satisfaction of a day's labor over the chatter of gossip, a woman whose strength was not just a body, but of character. In her heart, Elara had clung to those words, repeating them like a prayer, a mantra to fortify herself against the nagging voice of doubt that whispered of all the times she had been found wanting, all the times her generous figure had been a subject of cruel mockery, her thoughtful nature mistaken for simple-mindedness, her desire for a quiet life interpreted as a lack of spirit. She had been painstakingly, painfully honest in her own reply, describing herself not with self-pity, but with a simple, stark truth, writing the words, "I am a large woman, strong from years of hard work. I am not a delicate flower," and sealing the letter with a trembling hand, half expecting never to receive a response, already preparing for the fresh wave of disappointment. But a response had come, and it was that very letter, with its firm, clear script agreeing that honesty and hard work were the greatest virtues one could hope for in a partner, that now rested against her thigh in her purse, a tangible symbol of the fragile hope that had taken root in her heart, a hope so delicate she was almost afraid to breathe for fear of shattering it. The train car was mostly empty, adding to the surreal feeling of the journey, the vast, empty seats around her seeming to emphasize her solitude, the immense gamble she was taking with her future, placing her trust in the words of a stranger and the whims of fate. She watched a small, solitary bird keeping pace with the train for a moment before soaring away toward a copse of trees, and she felt a pang of envy for its freedom, its certainty of direction. Was she flying toward a new dawn, or simply fleeing a past that had offered her little kindness? She did not know. She could only hold on to the image she had built in her mind of a sturdy farmhouse, of fields stretching out under a wide sky, of a man who had seen not the size of her body, but the depth of her willingness to love and to build a life together. The train whistle blew along, lonely sound that echoed across the plains, and Elara closed her eyes, sending a silent plea out into the world that this hope, this desperate, beautiful hope, would not be left broken on a distant platform like so many of her other dreams had been. The wheels clacked on, each turn bringing her closer to her destiny, whatever it may be. The train's gradual, groaning deceleration was a physical sensation that pulled Elara from her deep reverie. The once blurred landscape outside the window, resolving itself with jarring clarity into distinct, sharp-edged details. A weathered fence post, a cluster of wildflowers nodding by the tracks, the stark, sun-bleached planks of a small station platform that seemed too modest to be the destination of such a monumental journey in her life. This was the place, the name of the town, painted in fading letters on a sign that swung gently in the breeze, a name she had whispered to herself so many times it had become a kind of incantation, a symbol of a future she dared to believe in. A sudden, cold wave of anxiety, entirely separate from the hopeful nervousness of the journey, washed over her, causing her fingers to tremble as she gathered her single, modest suitcase from the overhead rack, its lightness a stark contrast to the heavy weight of expectation that settled on her shoulders. She smoothed down the fabric of her dress, a futile gesture against the wrinkles of long travel, and took a deep, steadying breath, the air in the car suddenly feeling thick and difficult to draw into her lungs. This was the moment she had played out in her mind 1,000 times, each version a variation on a theme of cautious optimism. But now that it was here, the reality of it felt terrifyingly immense and utterly fragile. Stepping down from the train car onto the platform was like crossing a threshold into another world, the solidity of the wooden planks beneath her feet feeling strangely insubstantial, as if they might give way at any moment. The air here was different, scented with dust and distant rain and the sweet, dry smell of hay, a clean aroma that was nothing like the sooty dampness of the city. She stood for a moment, disoriented, her eyes scanning the platform, which was nearly deserted save for a few stacks of crates and a single, patient dog sleeping in a patch of sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and dread. And then she saw him. A man stood apart, leaning against a post, his figure tall and lean, etched with the muscular leanness of a life spent outdoors. He had the look of someone who had been waiting with pragmatic patience, his arms crossed over his chest, his hat pulled low over his eyes. This had to be Thomas. As if feeling the weight of her gaze, he looked up, and his eyes, a cool, distant blue, found hers across the platform. For a single, suspended second, there was nothing but the quiet assessment of a stranger. Then, his expression shifted, not into a smile of welcome, but into a slow, dawning realization that was followed not by pleasure, but by a profound and unmistakable disappointment that seemed to drain the very life from the air around them. He pushed himself off the post and walked toward her, his steps measured and heavy on the wooden boards, each one echoing like a final, closing door. He did not rush. His approach was that of a man fulfilling an unpleasant but necessary duty. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes performing a quick, efficient inventory from her worn traveling shoes to the neat braid coiled to the nape of her neck, and in that brief, brutal glance, Elara felt herself being completely and utterly dismissed. "Are you Elara?" he asked, his voice as flat and dry as the dusty platform beneath their feet, devoid of any warmth or curiosity, merely a question requiring confirmation. A desperate, fragile hope made her try to smile, a small, tentative gesture that felt like it might crack her face. "Yes," she said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast openness. "You must be Thomas." He did not return the smile. His mouth remained a stern, tight line. He looked her up and down once more, a final, contemptuous assessment, and shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Your letter," he began, and then paused, as if searching for the right words, though the ones he found were clearly chosen for their efficiency, not their kindness, did not say you were so large. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cruel. He stated it not as an observation, but as an accusation, a breach of some unspoken contract. "I need a wife to help on the farm, to keep up, not someone who will, well." He left the sentence hanging, the unspoken words, "not someone like you," more painful than any insult he could have voiced. "I am sorry," he said, and the apology was as empty as his eyes. This was a mistake. And with that, he turned on his heel, his decision made, his business concluded. He walked away with the same measured steps, never looking back, leaving her standing alone on the platform, the sound of his retreating footsteps swallowed by the vast, indifferent countryside. The tears that welled in her eyes were not just of sadness, but of a profound, soul-crushing humiliation, a confirmation of every dark fear she had ever harbored about her own worth. The train, its purpose at this station complete, gave a great, hissing sigh and began to pull away, taking with it the last tangible connection to the world she had known, abandoning her utterly in a place that had already rejected her before she had even set foot in it. The world seemed to shrink around Elara, collapsing inward until it contained nothing but the rough, sun-bleached grain of the wooden bench beneath her and the crushing weight of the silence that followed Thomas's retreat, a silence so profound it seemed to roar in her ears, louder and more oppressive than the train's engine had ever been. She was adrift, utterly and completely, cast aside on this tiny island of a platform in a vast sea of unfamiliar land, with no compass and no chart to guide her. The reality of her situation descended upon her with the cold, suffocating finality of a stone sinking into deep water. She had no money for a return ticket, the last of her meager savings having been spent on the fare that had brought her to this moment of absolute abandonment. The few coins left in her purse were a pathetic sum, enough for a meal or two, but nothing more, a cruel mockery of the resources needed to navigate such a catastrophe. Her suitcase, sitting forlornly at her feet, contained the entirety of her worldly possessions, a life distilled into a single, pathetic bundle of dresses and mementos that now seemed like artifact from a person who no longer existed, a hopeful ghost she had left behind on the tracks. The first tear fell, a hot, solitary drop that traced a path through the dust of travel on her cheek, and then there was no stopping the others. They came not in loud, dramatic sobs, but in a quiet, relentless torrent of despair, a silent acknowledgment of her complete and total ruin. She made no sound, her body trembling with the effort of containing the immense wave of grief and shame that threatened to tear her apart. She was invisible, she told herself, a forgotten piece of luggage left on a bench, of no more consequence to the world than the wind that now began to pick up, stirring the dust at the edge of the platform, and carrying with it the distinct, metallic scent of impending rain. The sky, which had been a clear, untroubled blue just moments before, was now rapidly surrendering to a rolling army of gray clouds, dark and heavy with unshed water, moving with a purposeful speed that mirrored the descent of her own spirits. The first drop hit her hand, a cold, startling shock against her skin, followed by another, and then another, until the air was filled with a soft, pattering whisper as the rain began to fall in earnest, a gentle yet persistent drizzle that seemed to weep for her when she could no longer weep for herself. It soaked slowly into the wool of her dress, darkening the fabric and adding a physical weight to the emotional burden she carried, the cold seeping through to her skin, a mundane misery atop the monumental one. She didn't move. What was the point? There was no shelter to seek, no warm hearth awaiting her, no purpose in preserving her comfort for a future that had been so decisively erased. She simply sat, her hands limp in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant, invisible point beyond the rain-streaked horizon, allowing the weather to mirror the desolation within her, a perfect external representation of her internal drowning. The sound of the rain was a lonely rhythm on the roof of the small station house, a tapping that seemed to say alone, alone, alone. It was in this state of complete surrender, this absolute void of hope, that a small, unexpected shift occurred in her perception. The rain abruptly ceased its assault on her head and shoulders. The constant, cold tapping on her scalp stopped, though she could still see and hear it falling in a shimmering curtain all around her. A small, dry circle of safety had somehow enveloped her. Blinking through her tears, her vision blurred and swimming. She looked up, confused, her mind slow to process this change in her circumstances. There, standing on the bench beside her, was a child, a little girl holding a large, dark green umbrella with a determined steadiness, its wide canopy shielding Elara from the storm. The girl was slight, with a face framed by wisps of hair the color of summer wheat, and eyes that were not filled with pity, but with a deep, curious concern, wide and intelligent, and fixed unwaveringly on Elara's tear-streaked face. She held the umbrella with both hands, her small arms stretched high to adequately cover the large woman on the bench, a silent testament to a strength that was more than physical. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the weeping woman and the solemn child, in a bubble of quiet amidst the falling rain. The girl's expression was one of unwavering seriousness, as if she were undertaking a task of immense importance. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the patter of the rain and the muffled sounds of Elara's grief. "Why are you crying, ma'am?" The question was so simple, so direct, and so devoid of judgment that it bypassed all of Elara's defenses. The raw, unvarnished truth was the only thing left to offer. Elara wiped clumsily at her face with a wet sleeve, her voice a hoarse, broken whisper. "The man I came to meet, he did not want me." The admission was a fresh agony, spoken aloud to this tiny stranger in the rain. The little girl's head tilted, her brow furrowing in thought. She processed this information not as an abstract tragedy, but as a practical puzzle to be solved. "Was it Mr. Thomas, the farmer?" she asked, her tone indicating that this was a logical guess, a connecting of dots in the small world she knew. The accuracy of the guess startled Elara out of her stupor. She looked at the girl with new eyes, seeing past her own pain for the first time. "How did you know?" she breathed, her voice barely audible. The girl's face grew even more serious, her small features setting with a resolve that seemed far beyond her years. She leaned in slightly, as if sharing a great secret, her words not an offer of sympathy, but a statement of fact, a new path suddenly revealed in the wilderness of Elara's despair. "My papa needs you," she said, her voice firm and certain, leaving no room for doubt or argument. It was not a question, not a suggestion, but a simple, profound declaration that hung in the rain-washed air between them, a lifeline thrown into the deep, dark water. The little girl's words, "My papa needs you," hung in the rain-drenched air between them, a statement so utterly unexpected and bizarrely authoritative coming from such a small frame that for a long moment, Elara could do nothing but stare, her mind, still sluggish with grief and the cold, struggling to process this sudden, strange turn of events. The declaration was not phrased as a hopeful suggestion or a vague offer of help. It was delivered with the unshakable certainty of a fundamental truth, as if the child were simply informing her of a law of nature, like the sun rising in the east or the rain falling from the sky. The sheer absurdity of it, the colossal disconnect between the cataclysmic failure of her own plans and this tiny person's serene assurance that she was, in fact, needed, created a cognitive dissonance so powerful it momentarily staunched the flow of her tears. Her despair, which had felt so absolute and impenetrable just seconds before, now had a hairline crack in its facade, and through that crack seeped a sliver of bewildered curiosity. The rain continued its gentle patter on the umbrella, a sound that now felt less like a mournful dirge and more like a private, intimate conversation happening just for the two of them under their makeshift shelter. Elara blinked, trying to clear her vision both of tears and of confusion. This child knew Thomas. She knew why Elara was here. The world, which had seemed so vast and empty and hostile moments ago, suddenly felt very, very small and intricately connected in ways she could not comprehend. "Your papa?" Elara finally managed to ask, her voice raspy from disuse and crying, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "Who is your papa?" The question was a lifeline, a first, tentative step out of the quicksand of her own misery and into the practical reality this little girl was presenting. The girl smiled then, a small, gentle upturn of her lips that seemed to hold a universe of kindness within it. "My name is Lily," she said, as if this answered everything. And in a way, it did, for a name gave her an identity, made her real and solid in this bewildering narrative. "My papa is Mr. Evans. Our farm is right next to Mr. Thomas's." She said this with a child's simple geography, outlining the boundaries of her world where neighbors were prominent landmarks. Her expression then grew somber again, her young face capable of conveying a deep and poignant understanding. "My papa is very kind," she stated, and the way she said it implied a comparison she was too polite to voice aloud, a clear distinction between the man who had left a woman crying in the rain and the man she called father. "But he is very sad." She looked down for a moment, her small shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of this shared family sorrow. "My mama is gone, and he works all day and is very lonely. He doesn't laugh anymore." Lily looked back up at Elara, her eyes earnest and pleading, and she continued, piecing together the story as she understood it. "I was in the general store yesterday. I heard Mr. Thomas talking to the shopkeeper. He said a lady was coming on the train today to be his new wife. He said he hoped she was sturdy." Lily's eyes flickered over Elara's form, not with judgment, but with a practical assessment. "I thought maybe I could see her, so I came to see." This admission of a child's simple curiosity now felt like an act of divine providence. She had been a witness to Elara's abandonment, a silent observer to Thomas's cruelty, and instead of turning away, she had chosen to intervene. Lily's gaze fixed on Elara's face, studying her features with an intensity that was both unnerving and comforting. "You have a nice face," she declared softly, as if this were the most important qualifying factor, the final piece of evidence that confirmed her plan. "Please come with me. My papa really does need help. And I think—" She paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I think he might need us too." The simple truth of that last statement landed squarely in Elara's heart. She looked from Lily's hopeful, rain-streaked face to her own small, pathetic suitcase, symbol of a failed dream, and then out to the empty, wet road where Thomas had disappeared. She had no other options. Every path behind her was closed, every door shut. The path forward was a mystery, offered by a child holding an umbrella. But in Lily's words, there was no judgment about her size, no dismissal of her worth. There was only a perceived need and an invitation to fill it. It was a gamble, but it was the only one left to take. The weight of her helplessness began to subtly shift into the lighter, more terrifying weight of choice. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like the first real breath she'd taken since stepping off the train, Elara nodded slowly, a movement that felt monumental. "All right, Lily," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its lost strength. "I will come and meet your papa." The brilliant, radiant smile that broke across Lily's face was like the sun bursting through the clouds, and as the little girl hopped off the bench and reached out her small, confident hand, Elara took it, allowing herself to be led away from the bench of despair and down a muddy path toward whatever awaited her. The muddy path that Lily led her down was a world away from the defined, man-made certainty of the train tracks and the station platform. It was a narrow, meandering ribbon of earth, softened by the rain into a slick, brown paste that clung to the hem of Elara's dress and the worn leather of her shoes with every determined step she took. The act of moving, of having a destination, however unknown, began to work a subtle magic on her spirit. The sheer physical effort of navigating the uneven ground pulling her out of the stagnant pool of her shock and self-pity and into the immediate present moment. Lily walked ahead with the unerring confidence of a creature in its native habitat, her small hand holding tightly to Elara's larger one, a warm, living tether that felt like the only solid thing in a universe that had, just minutes before, proven itself to be utterly unreliable. She chatted as they walked, her voice a bright, steady stream cutting through the dreary afternoon, pointing out landmarks that were invisible to Elara's city-trained eyes. A particular oak tree that was perfect for climbing, a bend in the creek where the water ran deep enough for swimming in the summer, a meadow where wild strawberries grew in the spring. Elara listened, saying little, her mind a whirlwind of frayed nerves and cautious, terrified hope. Each step took her further from the humiliation of the station. Each word from Lily's mouth painted a more detailed picture of the life she was being led toward, a life that was marked by a quiet, persistent sadness according to the child, but one that also contained climbing trees and swimming holes and strawberries. The landscape unfolded around them, rolling hills giving way to flatter, cultivated land, divided by ancient, stone-walled fences. The air was rich with the scent of wet earth, of green, growing things, and of wood smoke, a scent that grew stronger as they rounded a final bend in the path. And there it was, not the large, prosperous farmstead she had perhaps imagined for Thomas, but a smaller, more modest holding. The farmhouse was a low, sturdy structure of weathered gray wood and a stone chimney from which a thin, gray plume of smoke whispered into the damp sky. It was neat, the yard swept clean, but there was an air of quiet neglect about the place, a sense of a home that was maintained out of necessity but had lost its heart. The garden plot was weedy and overgrown at the edges, and the porch, while solid, held a lonely, empty rocking chair that seemed to be waiting for an occupant who never came. In the yard beside the house, a man was splitting wood, his back to them. The rhythmic thwack of the axe hitting the block was a sharp, percussive counterpoint to the soft sounds of the rain and their approaching footsteps. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and strong, his movements efficient and powerful with each swing. But even from behind, Elara could see a weariness in his posture, a slump in his shoulders that spoke of a fatigue that went deeper than mere physical labor. It was the weariness of a soul carrying a heavy burden alone. Lily dropped Elara's hand and ran ahead, her small voice calling out, "Papa! Papa, look!" The man's rhythm broke. He paused, the axe held mid-swing, and turned at the sound of his daughter's voice. His face, when he saw her, softened immediately, the lines of weariness easing into an expression of pure, paternal love. But then his eyes moved past Lily and landed on Elara, a stranger standing at the edge of his property, looking bedraggled and lost and utterly out of place. His expression shifted to one of startled confusion, and a faint wariness clouded his features. He carefully set the axe down against the chopping block and wiped his brow with the back of his arm, his eyes never leaving Elara. "Lily," he said, his voice a deep, calm rumble that was so different from Thomas's flat dismissal. "What's all this?" He took a few steps toward them, his gaze flicking from his daughter's excited face to Elara's apprehensive one, trying to piece together the puzzle. "Papa," Lily said, breathless from her run, grabbing his work-roughened hand and pulling him toward Elara. "This is the lady from the train, the one Mr. Thomas was supposed to meet. But he was mean to her, Papa, so mean. He said she was too big, and he left her all alone at the station in the rain. She was crying." Lily delivered this report with the brutal, unedited honesty of a child, and Elara felt a fresh wave of heat flood her cheeks, the humiliation now being witnessed by a second stranger. She wanted to shrink into the ground, to disappear. The man, Mr. Evans, looked from his daughter's indignant face to Elara's downcast one, and his own expression underwent a profound change. The wariness melted away, replaced first by a dawning understanding, and then by a deep, genuine compassion that seemed to radiate from him. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "I am Henry Evans," he said, his voice low and kind, filled with a warmth that felt like a physical shelter after the cold rejection she had endured. I'm so very sorry for what Thomas did. That was not right. That was no way to treat another person." He didn't look at her with assessment or judgment. He looked at her with empathy, seeing her not as a large woman, but as a human being who had been deeply wronged. His eyes took in her wet dress, the traces of tears still on her face, the hopeless slump of her shoulders. "You're soaked through," he said, his tone practical now, shifting from apology to action. "Please come inside and get warm by the fire. You are welcome here." He gestured toward the house, his invitation simple, direct, and utterly sincere. In that moment, his kindness was so overwhelming, so starkly different from anything she had expected to find in this place, that Elara felt the fragile dam inside her break again, not from despair, but from a profound, disbelieving sense of relief. She had been thrown away by one man, only to be gathered up by the kindness of another, and the sheer, unexpected grace of it was almost too much to bear. The interior of the Evans farmhouse was a direct reflection of the man himself. sturdy, unpretentious, and bearing the quiet marks of a life lived without a woman's touch. A space that was functional and clean, yet achingly devoid of the soft, nurturing details that transform a house into a home. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled, its warmth a palpable, welcoming embrace that began to seep into the cold that had settled deep in Elara's bones. The furniture was solid and plain, the floors swept bare, and the shelves held only the most essential of crockery. There was a lingering emptiness in the air, a silence that spoke of meals eaten quickly for sustenance and evenings spent in solitary contemplation rather than shared companionship. Henry, clearly flustered by the unprecedented situation, gestured awkwardly toward a wooden chair near the hearth. "Please sit. Warm yourself. I'll make some tea." He moved about the kitchen with a familiar clumsiness, his large hands fumbling slightly with the delicate kettle, a task that was so obviously outside his usual domain of axes and plows. Elara sat, her wet clothes steaming gently in the fire's heat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched him. She was a guest here, an unexpected burden, and the weight of that knowledge sat heavily upon her. She would not, simply take their charity without offering something in return. Gratitude was not a passive state. It was an action, a verb that required doing. As Henry placed a chipped but clean mug of hot tea in her hands, his kindness a tangible thing, her resolve solidified. When the gray light of dawn filtered through the windows the next morning, Elara was already awake, having spent a restless night on a narrow cot in a small, spare room that Henry had hastily prepared. She did not linger in bed, wallowing in the remains of her self-pity. Instead, she rose with a purpose that had been absent since she'd boarded the train days ago. She moved quietly through the silent house, her keen eyes taking inventory. She found the pantry, its stores meager and haphazardly organized. She found the flour bin, the yeast jar, and the salt crock. With an efficiency born of long practice, she built up the fire in the hearth until it roared with a cheerful intensity, and she set to work. By the time Henry and Lily emerged from their rooms, drawn by the most incredible aromas, a transformation had already begun to take hold. The air was warm and rich with the scent of baking bread, a smell so fundamentally comforting it seemed to push back the shadows in the corners of the room. On the rough-hewn table sat a plate piled high with golden brown biscuits, light and fluffy, beside a jar of wild honey and a pot of tea, steaming and ready. Elara stood by the fire, her face flushed from the heat, a simple apron tied over her dress. I hope you don't mind," she said, her voice still tentative. "I wanted to be useful." What began as a gesture of thanks quickly unfolded into a full-day exhibition of a competence and gentle strength that left Henry utterly speechless. After breakfast, while Henry went out to his morning chores, Elara did not retire. She found a broom and a rag, and she attacked the house not as a critic, but as a healer, dusting surfaces that had been ignored for months, sweeping floors until the wood grain showed clear, beating rugs until the dust motes danced in the sunbeams now breaking through the clouds. She discovered a basket of mending, one of Henry's shirts with a torn sleeve, several of Lily's dresses with missing buttons and unraveling hems, and she sat by the window, her needle flashing in the light, repairing the small tears in their lives with neat, invisible stitches. In the afternoon, she ventured outside, finding a neglected vegetable garden struggling against a tide of weeds. Without a word, she knelt in the earth, her strong arms and capable hands making short, efficient work of the task, freeing the young plants and turning the soil until the garden looked hopeful again. And through it all, she wove a thread of warmth and companionship. She talked to Lily as she worked, answering the child's endless questions, telling her stories that made her laugh, her own voice gradually losing its hesitant quality and regaining its natural, melodic tone. Henry, returning from the fields for his noon meal and again in the evening, could only stop and stare, his heart performing a slow, aching turn in his chest. He saw not a large woman, but a force of nature, a whirlwind of nurturing capability and quiet grace. He saw the way his daughter's face lit up in her presence, heard a laughter from Lily he hadn't heard since her mother passed. He saw the mended clothes, the clean house, the thriving garden, the delicious food, all tangible evidence of a care he had been unable to provide. He saw the easy way she moved in his home, not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged there, filling a void he had long since accepted as permanent. He watched her, this stranger who had been discarded for her appearance, and he saw, with a clarity that was breathtaking, her true and profound beauty. It was in the strength of her hands, the kindness in her eyes, the melody of her laughter, and the boundless capacity of her heart to give, even when she herself had been left with nothing. Each task she performed, each small kindness she offered, was a silent rebuttal to Thomas's cruelty, a living testament to her immeasurable worth. A week had woven itself into the fabric of life on the Evans farm. Each day, a thread of quiet routine and gentle transformation that subtly altered the pattern of their existence, softening the hard edges of grief and loneliness that had defined the household for so long. The air within the farmhouse, once thin and resonant with a hollow silence, now felt thick and warm, saturated with the lingering scent of baking bread, of simmering stews, of beeswax polish, and clean laundry dried in the sun, a symphony of domesticity that spoke of care and attention. Elara had, without fanfare or proclamation, simply folded herself into the daily rhythm of their lives, her presence becoming as natural and essential as the sunrise that broke over the eastern fields each morning. She found work not as a burden, but as a language of love, mending fences both literal and metaphorical, her capable hands always busy, her spirit a calm, steadying force that seemed to anchor the very farm itself. On this particular afternoon, the sun hung warm and golden in a clear blue sky, a stark and beautiful contrast to the gray drizzle of her arrival. Elara was in the yard, engaged in the simple, meditative task of hanging laundry on the line, the wet sheets and dresses snapping gently in the breeze, casting long, dancing shadows on the grass. She worked with a practiced ease, her movements economical and graceful, her face, though often serious in concentration, now frequently graced with a soft, contented smile that reached all the way to her eyes. It was in this peaceful moment that Henry found her. He had been watching her all week, his initial pity and neighborly concern slowly and irrevocably transforming into something far deeper, something he had long believed was lost to him forever, a feeling of profound admiration and a dawning, breathtaking love. He approached her slowly, his boots making quiet sounds on the damp grass, his heart thudding with a nervousness he hadn't felt since he was a young man. He stopped a few feet away, waiting for her to finish pinning a corner of sheet before he spoke her name. Elara. His voice was gentle, softer than she had ever heard it, and it carried a weight that made her turn to face him, a questioning look in her kind eyes. He took a deep breath, his own gaze steady and sincere, filled with an emotion so raw and genuine it made her breath catch in her throat. "I need to speak my truth to you," he began, his words careful and measured, chosen with the utmost respect. "When Lily brought you home that day, my intention was only to offer a neighborly kindness. I saw a woman in distress, and it was the right thing to do." He paused, his eyes searching hers, willing her to understand the journey his heart had taken. "But I was wrong to think so small. In this short time, you have brought more joy, more help, and more light to this farm and to our lives than I ever could have imagined was still possible." He took a small step closer, his hat held nervously in his hands. "Thomas," he said, and the name was not spoken with malice, but with a kind of weary dismissal, "was a fool. He was blinded by his own narrow expectations. He wanted an idea of a woman, a fantasy. But I—" His voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that resonated in the quiet air. "I have been blessed to see the real you, and she is perfect." The word hung between them, simple, devastating, and utterly sincere. "You are strong and kind and patient and wonderful." You have brought laughter back to my daughter's voice and peace back to this home." He reached out then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and took her work-roughened hand in his own. His touch was warm and firm. "This is your home now, if you wish it to be, not as a helper or a guest. Would you consider staying? As my wife? As Lily's mother?" Tears, but this time of pure, unadulterated happiness, welled in Elara's eyes, spilling over and tracing paths of joy down her cheeks. She had come across the country hoping for acceptance, and had found only rejection, only to be offered, by a twist of fate and a child's kindness, everything she had ever truly wanted: a home, a family, a love that saw and cherished her true self. She did not need to think. Her heart, so long burdened, now felt light enough to soar. She nodded, her smile radiant through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh yes." As if on cue, Lily, who had been watching from the doorway with hopeful, anxious eyes, let out a joyful cry and came running across the yard, launching herself into their embrace, completing the circle. They stood there together, the three of them, wrapped in each other's arms under the vast, generous sky, a family forged not from convenience or shallow promise, but from kindness, hard work, and the profound, simple act of seeing the beauty in another person's heart. If you enjoyed this story of finding where you truly belong, please like, subscribe, and share this tale of kindness and inner beauty with others.